All right, why don't we get started? My name is Glenn Pierce. I'm the Vice President of Medical for the World Federation of Hemophilia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a COVID webinar. With that, can I have the title? Thank you. It's COVID-19 Vaccines in People with Bleeding Disorders, Safety and Accessibility. This is the second webinar that we have done on COVID. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. We are broadcasting in a number of different languages, so you have the ability to select the language at the bottom of the screen on your computer. And then I also want to point out the question and answer box. And so during the presentations, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A area, and we will address them at the end. Next slide, please. If you're on a mobile phone, it may look a little bit different, but there are areas on the phone to be able to select the interpretation channel, such as the three dots on the bottom right, for interpretation. Today, we're going to cover some key issues in COVID-19 vaccines for people with bleeding disorders. We're then going to have two regulator perspectives, one from the EU, one from the United States, on the authorization of the COVID-19 vaccines. And then a COVAX update. We had a presentation at the last meeting on this, and so we'll go ahead and have an update on the status of COVAX and the distribution of vaccines into a number of different countries around the world. And we will finish with a panel discussion and live question and answer. Next slide, please. So as I said, I'm Glenn Pierce, Vice President for Medical of the WFH. And next slide, please. It's my pleasure to have the following panelists join us. Our first speaker will be Cedric Hermans. Dr. Hermans is the head of the Division of Hematology in the Hemostasis and Thrombosis Unit, as well as the Hemophilia Center at St. Luke University Hospital in Brussels, Belgium. He's a well-published Hemophilia Treatment Center director. He's been the past president of EHAD in Europe and is currently a member of the board of directors of the WFH with me. He's also has a graduate degree, a PhD from the University of Georgia. At the EMA, which is what she is representing today, she's worked as a scientific officer in the Office of Anti-Infectives and Vaccines with a main focus on vaccines. So she's well qualified to speak with us today about the COVID vaccine, which she has been very involved in during the pandemic. Our speaker from the FDA is Dr. Peter Marks, and he received his PhD in cell and molecular biology and his medical degree at New York University, and completed his residency trainings in hematology oncology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Peter has worked in a number of academic centers, caring for patients, and in industry as well on drug development. He joined the FDA almost 10 years ago and became the center director for the Center of Biologics Evaluation in January 2016, and has been a point person on the COVID-19 vaccine at the FDA during this pandemic. Our next speaker representing COVAX is Claudia Nanai, and she's a health economist with a specialization in management of health programs and more than 12 years experience in university hospitals in strategic planning and performance monitoring. She's been with the WHO for the past 10 years and has led work on performance monitoring and evaluation there. as well as access to products program and the R&D blueprint at the WHO. She has a master's degree in the management of public health organization and is a 2022 doctoral candidate at the University of Bath, UK. Congratulations for that, Claudia. And she's currently the WHO lead for the Joint Allocation Task Force for COVAX. And then rounding out our panel is Dr. Radek Kazmarek. He is a postdoctoral research associate at the Gene and Cell Therapy Group, the Wells Center for Pediatric Research at the Indiana University School of Medicine. Radek also chairs the Coagulation Product Safety, Supply, and Access Committee for the World Federation of Hemophilia, which has been very involved in monitoring and managing the COVID response from the WFH. So with that, if I could have the next slide, please. I also want to point out that we have a lot of information on our website. We have our previous webinar, which we gave about a month and a half ago or so. We have published a number of papers also on vaccination and risks of COVID in the hemophilia and bleeding disorders population. So those are easily accessible on the website. Next slide, please. I want to point out a couple of things since we are a global organization and we represent individuals with bleeding disorders from a variety of different countries of different socioeconomic strata. And it's clear that what we're seeing here is really in parallel to what we see with the availability of treatment products within the bleeding disorders community. And as a result, we have a huge contrast between rich countries and the poorer countries. We're going to have some discussion on that here, but it's worth pointing out that we need to continue advocacy to drive the availability of vaccines into all of the countries that are within the WFH framework. Next slide, please. This shows a map, and as I mentioned, the map is really very similar to the kinds of maps that we can show for the availability of clotting factor concentrates. And so what we see here is when the expected vaccination is for various countries around the world, mid to late 21, 22, late 22. And you can see that the red is from 23 onwards. And so we expect that we will have a continued pandemic in a number of our member countries. And that's something that will be addressed in the discussion today. Next slide, please. With that, I would like to welcome Dr. Hermans. Cedric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenn. And thank you for the opportunity to give this first presentation of these very important topics. So what I would like to do now is to summarize some major issues regarding COVID-19 vaccination in patients with bleeding disease. So this slide summarizes some of the multiple complications that this virus has had on our community over the last 18 months. Clearly, we have learned a lot recently about the epidemiology of COVID-19, about the risk factors to be exposed to the virus, to develop the disease. We also know exactly what's the clinical presentation in patients with and without bleeding disease. And also, we are now in a better position to manage patients who require hospital admission. As you know, vaccines have been recently developed, validated, and they are now available for patients with hemophilia. And clearly what we would like to do today is to discuss the specific modalities of vaccination of in patients with inherited bleeding disease. It's clear that in the future we'll have to learn more about the impact of this pandemic on hemophilia care. And it's clear that we will probably learn a lot from this major episode. It's also very likely that there will be positive impact effects of this pandemic on our community. I would like to share with you this slide summarizing how proactive our community has been over the last 18 months. As you remember, in March 2020, in the Hemophilia journal, we published this editorial about the new challenges. And then, as you all know, I'm sure that we will address and discuss this during the Q&A session. The management of patients with hemophilia developing COVID-19 could be more complicated than in patients without bleeding disease. And we have addressed this by producing important papers that were published in the course of last year. Much more recently, when vaccination was initiated, we produced a commentary that was also published in the Hemophilia journal, summarizing the rationale and the modalities of vaccination. And this is what I will focus on during the next 2-3 minutes. So clearly, this is the paper that is freely accessible on the Wiley website of the Hemophilia journal. Next slide. So first of all, patients with bleeding disease should clearly understand the modalities of vaccination. And this is also why this kind of education activity is important. All patients should understand how vaccination works, what is the science behind this, and also understand why and how quickly these important vaccines have been developed. It's also very clear, and this is a message that we should keep spreading in our community, is that our patients should be vaccinated like everyone else. And honestly, this is what I do on a daily basis when running my clinic. Next. So what I would like to do now is to focus on some of the modalities and precautions that should be followed when providing vaccinations to our patients. Well, it's clear that patients with bleeding disease, inherited bleeding disease, do not represent by themselves a priority group for vaccination. It's not because you have a bleeding disease that you should be more quickly vaccinated than other people. But it is clear that if you have an inherited bleeding disease and risk factors for severe COVID-19 disease, such as advanced age, major comorbidities, hypertension, diabetes, very severe chronic disease, well, in that situation, it's very likely that you will be considered as belonging to the priority group. But you need to know that it's not because you have severe hemophilia A or B or severe von Willebrand disease and you are 25, 30 years of age, you should get priority. This is not the case. An important concept too is that considering the knowledge that is available today, there is no reason to select a particular type of vaccine. I'm sure that we will discuss this later on during the Q&A session. The vaccines are different. Some of them have been associated with some side effects, and we will discuss this. But at this time, there is no reason to select a specific vaccine in most patients. Very importantly, and although patients with bleeding disease have been educated not to receive intramuscular injection or to do this with a great level of caution, it's clear that considering the mode of action of this anti-COVID-19 vaccine, this vaccine has to be administered in the muscles, in the cells of the muscle, because this is how they will work. And this is a very important concept. So don't miss this very important piece of practical information. Next slide. It's clear that ideally hemostatic support should be provided, but you need to know that this hemostatic support will depend on the severity of the bleeding disease. It's clear that for patients with mild bleeding disease, with hemophilia A or B, with a factor 8 or 9 level, which is above 10%, honestly, there is no specific hemostatic precaution that should be provided. However, if you have a severe hemophilia A or B, severe von Willebrand disease, well, ideally, if you could receive your vaccine after a dose, even a small dose of clotting factor, that should be better. For patients who are currently treated with the bispecific antibody emicizumab, well, these patients are intrinsically protected, considering the constant level of protections afforded by that drug. Also, you need to know that there is no specific contraindication to vaccinations related to hemophilia or other bleeding disease. So you might have hemophilia A, B, you might have another clotting factor deficiency, you might have a platelet dysfunction disorder. Well, clearly it's not because you have this kind of disease that there is any specific contraindication to receive your vaccine. I think this is also a very important message to all of you. Next. Also, vaccination is not contraindicated in patients on immunosuppressive agents. This is an important information too. If you are on cortisone or other agents that could reduce your immunity, well, this is not a contraindication. It's very likely that it might be, and this is what we do in our center, that your immune response should be assessed, and if possible, we try to measure the level of protecting antibodies that appear in your blood after vaccination. That should be ideal, but by itself, being on cortisone or other agents is not a contraindication. Very important message too. Also, as you know, we are promoting participation in clinical studies, and there are many clinical studies currently going on. You should also know that vaccination is not contraindicated, but very importantly, as any event taking place during this kind of trial, that should be carefully reported to the study investigators. So this is what this is routine practice for patients in clinical trials, but that should strictly be followed. And also, and this is increasingly important, since the ambition, in my view, is to vaccinate all human beings on this planet as soon as possible, irrespectively of their continent, health status, and so on. So clearly, all initiatives that would help to inform patients with hemophilia and contribute to an effective vaccination program should be strongly encouraged. And I think this is totally in line with the ambition of this webinar. So I will stop here and answer questions at the end. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker, Dr. Manuel Mura.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see me and hear me well. Okay, thank you. So I will speak today to you about the safety of COVID-19 vaccines in the European Union, starting from development and authorization up to vaccination in real life. Next slide, please. As you know, 4 vaccines so far have been authorized in the European Union by the European Medicines Agency. Comirnaty and Moderna contain a messenger RNA, which carries the instruction to express the spike protein from SARS-CoV-2, which is causing COVID-19. AstraZeneca and Janssen use instead a non-replicating adenovirus, which has been, some of his gene has been deleted, and that's why he cannot replicate anymore. And they have been replaced with the gene to produce the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. These vaccines do not cause the disease, and they do not contain the virus. And here you see in the picture the dates where the different vaccines were approved for use in the European Union. And the most recent one has been the Janssen vaccine, which was authorized on the 11th of March. Next slide, please. So these vaccines so far have been authorized under the so-called conditional marketing authorization, which means that not all the data that normally are requested for a vaccine are available at the time of approval, and some are therefore requested post-authorization under specific obligations. However, as set in the reflection paper, which was published in November by the EMA, and you have the link in this slide, a specific level of requirement and data are should be submitted anyway under the conditional marketing authorization to allow to conclude on a positive benefit risk. And regarding safety specifically, this is in the order of thousands of subjects to be investigated in clinical trials, with the follow-up time of at least 6 weeks after vaccination, because this is the time window where the majority of the side effects are seen. Long-term follow-up is also relevant, of course, and this is being collected and will be assessed as soon as available for both safety and efficacy. So the trials should continue ongoing also after having reached their primary endpoint for efficacy, and they should continue until their duration. Rare adverse reaction, which are those occurring with a frequency of less than 1 into 1,000, are very unlikely to be defined in the context of the pre-approval clinical trial, and therefore they will require post-approval surveillance studies. Next slide, please. So overall, for the vaccines that have been approved so far against COVID-19, the benefit-risk balance is positive, which means that we have a good level of efficacy and an acceptable safety profile, which is considered comparable to the vaccine that have been so far authorized for other diseases. And specifically, no vaccine is safe 100%, like for any other medicine. There are some side effects, but for vaccine, including COVID-19 vaccine, normally most common side effects are mild or moderate in severity, and they are temporary. And for COVID-19, they include vaccines. They include pain and tenderness at the injection site, headache, tiredness, muscle and joint pain, nausea, chills, and fever. The very large safety data sets for all the COVID-19 vaccine, which included up to 44,000 people, have allowed a good characterization of the uncommon adverse events, which are those occurring in less than 1 person every 100 vaccinees. And in addition, rare and very rare events are now being detected from post-authorization from large mass vaccination campaign. And I will talk a little bit more about this in the coming slide, but especially I want to flag to you 2 very rare events, which are the severe allergic reaction that have occurred in people receiving COVID-19 vaccines in approximately less than 1 person into 100,000 vaccinees, and also the thrombosis associated with thrombocytopenia syndrome, the so-called TTS syndrome, which is also very rare and has been associated with AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccination, with an estimated frequency of around 1 vaccine in 100,000 vaccinees. And this event is still under investigation. Long-term safety is being monitored and in line with the pharmacovigilance legislation, and I will tell you more in the coming slides. And here you have the link at the bottom of the slide of the European Public Assessment Reports, which contains the full set of data and assessments and conclusion of the EMA to support the approval of these vaccines in the European Union. Next slide. So safety monitoring of vaccines, when is it done? Basically, safety is studied from the beginning of the development until the use in real life, and it never stops for as long as a product remains on the market. And in this slide, you see in blue the different steps in the development of a product, which include the development of the manufacturing process, the assessment of the quality of the vaccine, the non-clinical studies in animal model, the clinical trials in human, followed by the evaluation and decision by regulatory authorities, scale-up manufacturing, and then the vaccine is authorized and is in use in the general population. And in pink, you see the safety monitoring, which starts, and as I said, cover the whole development, looking, for example, that the quality of the vaccine is in line with the legal requirements and ensures the safety use of the product. Toxicity is evaluated in animal studies to be able to understand tolerability before the vaccine is tested in humans, and then all the safety is monitored in clinical trial and post-authorization as well. What we use in Europe to collect all the suspected side effects is called a data set called EudraVigilance, which is the European database of suspected adverse reaction to medicines. And in addition to this tool, part of the post-marketing safety monitoring is also the safety studies, for example, which can be conducted by the companies or academia or other organizations, reports in the medical literature, information from other regulators worldwide, and any report that is coming from patients and healthcare professionals. Next slide. So the EudraVigilance, as said, is the European database of suspected adverse reaction to medicine. And here you have a link that you can access, and you can see all the reported events are all there. What is important to mention is that, for example, up to 25 May, we had a total of 500,000 cases of suspected side effect for COVID-19 vaccine globally. But this does not mean that all of them are caused by a vaccine, because at this stage, they're only suspected because of a temporal association with vaccination. Other analyses are necessary and are conducted to assess causality and association with the vaccine and to validate the potential signal. This system in Europe is monitored by EMA, is managed by EMA, who is monitoring the report and is making analysis and supporting the committees in their decision for safety in a timely manner. Next slide, please. So, for example, we cannot use all the events in the EudraVigilance dataset to understand or to foresee the likelihood of an event being associated with a vaccine, because they need to be contextualized. So, for example, these numbers, which you can see in this slide in pink, purple, for the different vaccines authorized, they need to be put into context into how many people have been vaccinated so far and for how long the vaccine has been on the market. For Comirnaty, you see the highest number of suspected reports, 146,000, but you need to consider that these are in the context of over 200 million people being vaccinated. Next slide. So, how does the EMA assess if a side effect could be caused by the vaccine? There are several analysis techniques which are used to assess this. One of the main analyses is the so-called observed to expected analysis. And its aim is to contextualize the number of reports of suspected adverse effect received. Indeed, when millions of people are monitored, some of them are bound to develop illness naturally. And if these people are vaccinated, some of these diseases can still develop naturally and might occur in close proximity to vaccination. So the purpose of this observed versus expected analysis is to estimate the expected number of the cases that would occur naturally and compare them with the number of cases that are actually observed in vaccinated people. So that if in vaccinated people we see a higher number of cases than what we would expect, then this means that there may be something going on and that needs need to be investigated further. Next slide. So what is EudraVigilance telling us? This is a snapshot of the most reported side effects with COVID-19 vaccine since their approval. And as you can see, these are the ones that I already mentioned a few slides back. And so they are confirming what we have seen in the clinical trials. And they are already listed in the summary of product characteristics. Next slide, please. It is important to note that anyone can report a suspected side effect to their national authority or to the vaccine manufacturer, and then all these reports will all go to the EudraVigilance database. There are several rules depending on the country in Europe how to do this, and here is a link for further information. But just to point out, if you look at the picture on the right, that more or less half of the reports have come from patients and half from healthcare professionals. So the patient has an important role in trying to identify what they believe is a suspected adverse event and report it promptly. Next slide. Vaccine monitoring in Europe is not only focusing on EudraVigilance. We have the legal provisions are set in the legislation, and these and a guidance are described in the good pharmacovigilance practice modules, which are published on the EMA website. And in addition, EMA has also prepared a pharmacovigilance plan for application in the European Union for COVID-19 vaccine. You have a link in the title. So this clarifies the importance of reporting, spontaneous reporting of suspected reaction to EudraVigilance, and the quality of the report is important as well for the regulators to be able to draw robust conclusions, and also the timely reporting for serious events, less than 15 days is the recommended time frame. In addition, there is a risk management plan which details is agreed with the regulatory authorities pre-authorization, and it details what the company must do post-authorization to further monitor the safety profile of the vaccine. So it includes monitoring activities, but also safety studies that are decided specifically for each vaccine. The manufacturer must also submit periodic safety reports, which are called PSUR, and they are submitted every 6 months. However, in the context of a pandemic, some reports called the monthly summary safety reports must be submitted on a monthly basis, so that we have obviously more timely information, and they will include suspected reaction, but also information on the sales to also contextualize the reports based on how much the vaccine is used. Exposure data, which means indeed how many people have been vaccinated, are essential, as I said, for many pharmacovigilance analyses, like the observed versus expected, which we just discussed. And in addition to manufacturer, also member states are gathering this data via, for example, national registers. And EMA is collecting this data, compiling them, and analyzing them on a daily or weekly basis, depending on the event. In addition, EMA is conducting or funding studies together with academic organizations. For example, some are looking at defining the background rates of suspected adverse events to contextualize the reports for COVID-19 vaccines. And some others are investigating specific hypotheses, for example, on TTS, the thrombocytopenia syndrome, or on how history of coagulopathy and related treatments might be associated with thromboembolic events after vaccination. Next slide. So this slide is just to show you, to give you an example of how the EU regulatory network and the Pharmacovigilance Committee of EMA, the PRAC, has worked in March, as soon as we received the first reports of thromboembolic events potentially associated with vaccination. The first reports arrived probably around the 5th or the 7th of March. On the 11th, there was enough information to be able to validate the signal. And then in less than a month, the PRAC was able to define the presence of the signal, to establish that there was a potential link between the vaccination and the TTS syndrome. And there has been several communications within this month to inform the public of the ongoing analysis and of interim results of the assessment, including letters to the healthcare professionals to inform them of the symptoms, and so to be prepared, to be aware, and therefore this can minimize the risk for the patient and they can be treated immediately. In addition, an ad hoc expert meeting was also held on 29 of March. These experts included hematologists, neurologists, cardiologists, which had expertise valid to discuss these events of thromboembolism and thrombocytopenia potentially associated with the AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccine. So this is a system that is robust and agile, and in place, able to rapidly detect and minimize serious risk, having gathered a lot of experience from the H1N1 2009 pandemic. Next slide. And this is just an example of where all this information goes, because all the safety monitoring from the trial and from post-authorization monitoring of the products is reflected in section 4.8 of the summary of product characteristics and in the package leaflet. And this is an example for Vaxzevria, where you see the adverse reactions, which are the events for which a link to vaccination is at least a possibility, and then the frequency is also established wherever possible. Next slide. So to conclude, the message I want you to take home are that all approved vaccines in the European Union are shown to offer a good level of protection against COVID-19, and they have an acceptable risk profile And these two information are allowed to conclude on a positive benefit-risk balance, which supports authorization. For the safety perspective, most side effects are mild to moderate in severity. They are gone within a few days, with the exception of very rare events that we have discussed. Vaccines have been granted a conditional marketing authorization. So this is not an emergency use, it's a marketing authorization, but there are conditions that companies must respect, which are specific obligations, and which means that they have to submit some missing data, including long-term safety data and additional studies in population which were not studied pre-authorization within pre-specified timelines post-authorization. Another important concept is that safety monitoring does not stop with authorization, but continues for as long as a medicine is on the market. And the pharmacovigilance system that is set up in the European Union is robust and able to detect rapidly any safety issue and allow the regulatory authority to minimize serious risk to patients as much as possible. Timely exchange of information have proven to be critical during the pandemic. EMA is in constant discussion with FDA, Health Canada, MHRA, WHO, and other regulators globally to share information and discuss and as much as possible take a common approach to harmonize and use of the vaccine. We have increased our transparency massively, and because communication is critical and the purpose is to clarify to the public why we take decisions, when we take them, and for what reason, so that we reassure the public that vaccines are safe and vaccination remain critical to control the pandemic. And this ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuel. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Marks. Peter?
Thanks very much. So I'm going to try to go a little bit quickly since I know we're running a little bit behind, and some of the material I was going to cover has already been touched upon. So I have the next slide, please. You know, one of the important things to understand about COVID-19 vaccine development is that the process of developing these vaccines was accelerated not by cutting corners, but by helping these products to move ahead by providing clear guidance on how the product should be made, by having the manufacturers work with regulators in a way that they don't normally do to move ahead the development, by collapsing the various stages of clinical trials into one. And for instance, the Pfizer-BioNTech clinical trial was a phase 1, 2, 3 trial so that the trial could move ahead very quickly. Additionally, while these vaccines were being studied, the manufacturing was being scaled up and many numbers of vaccines were being produced. That's something that usually doesn't happen in practice. Usually one waits till the end of the process. And then in the United States, we have a regulatory pathway called emergency use authorization that allowed us to make these available relatively rapidly after their efficacy was shown in clinical trials. If I can have the next slide. Normally, these vaccines would be made available under a biologics license application. That's a general approval in the United States. And that standard is that we have good data from clinical trials and safety data as well. Have the next slide. Instead, we use the emergency use authorization powers, which we have, which allows us to make available products in public health emergencies when there's not an approved and available alternative. The standard for these is lower than for the biologics license application, and the products may be effective and the known and potential benefits have to outweigh the known and potential risks. However, in the case of vaccines, if I can have the next slide, we determined that we wanted to have a somewhat higher standard for vaccines that is more akin to what we normally use for a biologics license. And that's why, as was already mentioned, the studies for these were large to demonstrate efficacy in a clear and compelling manner and to demonstrate safety from at least a median of 2 months of follow-up. And we've done our approvals here, or I should say our authorizations in a very transparent manner. And we are undertaking, just as was also mentioned, enhanced post-market surveillance of these authorized vaccines. And the next slide, just to mention the 3 authorized vaccines in the United States include the Pfizer-BioNTech, the Moderna, and the Janssen vaccines. I have the next slide. All of these vaccines are highly effective in preventing COVID-19. They prevent hospitalization and death equally well. The differences here, they were studied in somewhere between 30,000 and 45,000 individuals, rounded roughly. The studies were 1-to-1 randomized and across a cross-section of the population, including a fair number of older individuals. Go to the next slide. The efficacy these were also studied in pediatric patients in the case of Pfizer-BioNTech. The other studies are ongoing for the Moderna and Janssen vaccines. For the Pfizer's vaccine, there were also 2,200, it's actually 2,260 children studied totally, and again with reasonable demographics to mirror the population here in the United States. And next slide, please. The efficacy of these vaccines was excellent. As I mentioned, they all prevent death and hospitalization from COVID-19 equally well. There is a slight benefit in terms of, or a modest benefit for the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines in prevention of milder forms of COVID-19. That comes at the cost of doing a 2-dose regimen, a 2-jab regimen versus Janssen, which is a single jab regimen. But again, all very effective against the more severe forms of COVID-19. If I have the next slide, if we look at the efficacy in pediatrics for the Pfizer vaccine, it generates a very good immune response. The immune response in 12 to 15-year-olds was actually superior. It was looked better than the immune response in 16 to 25-year-olds. For all intents and purposes, what matters is it's at least the same. If I can have the next slide. Very importantly, in the 12 to 15-year-old age category, in 1,005 vaccinated 12 to 15-year-olds comparing to 978 unvaccinated or placebo individuals in that age range, the vaccine was very effective. No one out of the 1,005 12 to 15-year-olds got COVID-19 compared to 16 12 to 15-year-olds who got the saline placebo. So very encouraging in the pediatric population for the Pfizer vaccine. If I have the next slide, and was already mentioned, so I won't belabor it, that the most common side effects with these vaccines are short-term and self-limited pain at the injection site, potentially flu-like symptoms for a day or two. The most common thing that adults tend to note is feeling tired, which generally lasts a day or so and then goes away. It's particularly the case after the second dose of the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines. If we go to the next slide, please. The pediatric safety for the Pfizer vaccine is very similar. The 12 to 15-year-olds had very similar safety profile to the 16 to 25-year-olds, and the 16 to 25-year-olds have very similar safety profile to the 25 to 55-year-olds. So the safety is very similar throughout. And I should just remind you that in the 12 to 15-year-olds, it's the same vaccine regimen for Pfizer that's used, same dose and same schedule of the 2 doses 3 weeks apart. Next slide, please. We continue in the United States now that actually we're getting pretty close to having 300 million doses administered here in the United States between first and second doses of the mRNA vaccines. And the safety monitoring is ongoing. We do that both by safety reporting passively. That's reports that come into us, as well as active safety monitoring. You've heard about that already, but just to reiterate, just as in the European Union, Safety monitoring here in the United States is a very important aspect of this because clearly that's very important to all of us to make sure that people are confident that we are watching out for the safety of the vaccines. Next slide, please. So just to finish up here, COVID-19 vaccine development has been something that has been remarkable. These vaccines were developed in about a year or less's time, and they've been deployed quite widely now. We will continue to watch them very closely, but the most important piece of information I can leave with is that these vaccines are making a big difference, and getting vaccinated is a very important part of preventing the continued cycle of COVID-19. And as more and more people get vaccinated, we are concerned that if there are people who are unvaccinated, they may be susceptible to the more spreadable variants of COVID-19 that have emerged since the start of the pandemic, ones like the South African variant and the Indian 617 variant that has been recently described. So getting vaccinated is a good thing because at least right now, the COVID-19 vaccines that are deployed in the United States are able to prevent all of the circulating variants of COVID-19, at least to a greater or lesser extent. So thanks so much for your attention. I'll look forward to questions later.
Thank you, Peter. Our final speaker is Claudia Nanai, who I'll turn the floor over to now. Claudia.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all the participants. We can move straight into the next slide that is slightly different from the heavy red word map that Glenn showed at the beginning. This is a slide where you can see the use of the COVID-19 vaccines across 211 countries, areas, territories, or economies. You know, we have several definitions for our countries. And you see where this 1,870,000,000 doses have been administered. You see the distribution, indeed, if you remember the heavy red African continent from the previous slide, now here is a very soft green, meaning there are indeed vaccination campaigns that have started. Some are better advanced than the others, but there are still spots where vaccines have not been introduced. You know, I will be talking to you about COVAX. COVAX is a global access mechanism that combines countries that are assisted through donations for vaccine use and countries that are procuring the vaccines through COVAX, but with their own finances. So this mechanism has served so far 127 participants with 77 million, almost 80 million doses. As you can see, it's only a little above 4% of the overall circulating doses, the quantities that COVAX has been able to ship to its participants. But it's a start. In the next slide, if we can advance, you see what has happened. So this is again the same map, but in darker blue, you see those countries. I'll use countries for simplicity. Those countries that have been served through COVAX and that have started the vaccinations. So the the situation is not perfect yet, but it's improving. I wanted to give you a sense with the next slide, please, of what's happening. The organizers asked to focus on the dichotomy that we see out there between high income and low income countries. And indeed, if you look at this table, for sure, there is a lion's share that has been of these 1.8 billion doses that has been absorbed and used in one country. But even if we expand, we see that 77% of all doses, these 1.8 billion doses administered, are in reality used by top 10 countries. There is a lot of work to be done in that sense. In the next slide, I want to show you what's happening. You know that the UN family has a mix of organizations and that not all countries in the world are members of these organizations. For the World Health Organization, we have 194 member states, as we call them. And we can see now that out of these 194 member states, 185 have started COVID vaccination. And you can see that the missing ones are in the African region, the Latin American region, the Southeast Asia, and the Western Pacific region. But you can also see that in the Eastern Mediterranean and European region, all countries have started vaccination. If we move to the next one, I'll give you a little bit more detail about we go beyond the 194 member states, we go back to the 211 countries, areas, territories, and economies. And just to make your life easier, at the end of the presentation, I have included a table where I show you the sources of all these country names, territories names, but you look at them from the comfort of your house without me voicing it over. Just to say that the situation by income level is still demonstrating inequities. As you can see, all high-income countries have indeed started the vaccination, are vaccinating their population. Also, upper middle-income economies are in the same situation. But from lower middle-income economies down, we have not been able to reach all populations. And again, please consider that we are talking about very few quantities per population in some instances. If we move to the next one, we go a bit deeper in those 9 economies where there are no vaccination campaign started yet. And here you see who they are. We have some of them are part, and you'll see it in the next slide, some of them are part of COVAX, other decided not to join this Global Access Initiative. And you see that, unfortunately, the situation is still unclear. 6 of them, otherwise, are part of COVAX. And so the partners of this initiative, you know, there is not only WHO, UNICEF, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They are all aiming to help these 6 countries to be able to roll out the vaccination campaign. Somehow things are advancing fast. You see some of the countries have the vaccine in their territory. Others are still waiting to receive the shipment at the port of entry, but things are moving and advancing. if we move to the next slide, you'll see that that out of all the doses circulating, the 1.8 billion doses circulating out there, only 17.3 of these doses have been administered in low-income and low-middle-income countries. However, populations in these countries represent 47.7% of the world population. So again, the situation of inequity to be addressed. In the next slide, I'm going fast because more or less these are the same concepts, but we look at them from different angles. In the next slide, though, we are showing how advancing over time with more supply becoming available, these inequities are little by little being reduced. If you look at the ratio of high-income countries to low-income countries that received and vaccinated their populations or in February, though it was non-comparable. However, moving along, we arrive in May, middle of May, and this difference is reduced, if we can say reduced, to 69 times more doses being administered to high-income countries' populations compared to low-income countries. A lot of work still to do. I want to give you a sense in the next slide of where those, how much, what proportion are we talking about? So here you can see we take the 40 dose per 100 population, because it's basically given almost all vaccines have a 2-course regimen. It's 20% of the population that we consider from a global perspective was the top priority, the most at risk to reduce the mortality and protect the health system capacity to respond to this pandemic. So focusing on those populations with high risk of dying from COVID, and healthcare workers, frontline health and social care workers. So this 20% is more or less an average across the world, with big disparities. There are countries where healthcare workers represent 6% of the population, and countries where healthcare workers represent 0.05% of the population, but on average globally. 20%, covering 20% of this population, of country's population, was given was creating a floor, as we call it, to ensure the most at risk were vaccinated. Here you can see that only 2 low-income countries have achieved this 20% of population coverage, and these are Bhutan and Mongolia. It becomes a bit better if we go to the next slide, that is my last slide, and you see that the number increases if we reduce this threshold to 10% of the population. And you see Mongolia, Bhutan, Morocco, El Salvador, and Micronesia Federal State having achieved this target. There is, you have heard, obviously, in all newspapers and news outlets, that the very, very, very limited supply has been secured by high-income countries in contracts that allow them to access doses that cover 5, 6, 10 times their own population. So just recently, there has been a call from our Director General and several other representatives from United Nations Group and heads of state to increase donations of the excess doses they have secured through their contracts to those countries that, as you can see, have almost completed their vaccination efforts, and to ensure that these doses reach the rest of the world, because nobody will be protected until everybody is protected. So if we want to really end this pandemic, we need to go towards a more equitable sharing of this very, very limited supply. Thank you very much. I'm happy to reply to any questions later in the panel.
Thank you, Claudia. And if I could ask all of the panelists to put their cameras on, we have quite a few questions. And while a number of them have been addressed in the formal presentations, which have been terrific, by the way, I think it's worth emphasizing some once again. A lot of them involve safety and in balancing the risk of taking the vaccine versus the risk of an adverse event. And all of our speakers have really covered that, but let's get into some details here. One question involved an individual with factor V Leiden deficiency, which is excess coagulation. And I would like perhaps Cedric and then Peter to offer his perspective as well on the risk in factor V Leiden. Cedric?
Thank you, Glenn. Well, honestly, I think there is no impact of this, very frequent genetic variant on the risk, the tolerance, and certainly not the risk of thrombosis. I have not seen any data supporting this. So people with factor V Leiden should be vaccinated as other people without any specific precautions, in my view.
Peter, any further comments?
I would just add in, completely agree, and would say that we've looked to see for the AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines, it doesn't seem like the adverse events that are occurring in terms of thrombosis, thrombocytopenia syndrome are at all related to any of those factors anyway. So I think any one of the vaccines is reasonable to use. So again, I completely agree.
Okay, and then related question really involves, I'd like to get the regulators' perspectives. And it's the risk of these thrombotic events versus the risk of COVID, either transmitting it or getting it yourself. And so there have been a number of questions that seem to be focused on the very rare thrombotic events. And so I'd like to ask you both to go ahead and once again put that into perspective relative to the entire situation of the pandemic. Start with Manuela.
Yes, thank you. Of course, that is a very important question, and how the EMA is approaching this aspect is that the benefit risk of the product is considered positive in all age and in all groups, because the event that we are talking about is very rare and is more likely to suffer from COVID consequences, which could be serious and lethal. And this keeps the benefit risk positive. In addition to this, despite few of the cases of TTS have been lethal, we have seen that the mortality rate has been decreasing over time. And this is possibly due to awareness of what is happening, so that doctors know, and patients as well, what to look for. So we have published a series of symptoms which, if you have them within 3 weeks from vaccination, that is a flag that you need to reach your doctor immediately, and then an appropriate action can be taken very fast so that the risk of the syndrome can be minimized. And we have seen that this is actually having an effect. In addition, we have also, the agency has also prepared a contextualization of the risk. So there is an analysis has been done at the request of the European Commission and the member states to contextualize the risk of TTS in the context of the epidemiology of the disease. So how many hospitalization, death, ICU are linked with COVID, and how much the vaccines are, the AstraZeneca is effective to protect against those, and to contextualize the risk of TTS in this aspect. And these graphs are on our website for you to have a look, but confirm that in the majority of the age, I mean, with increasing age, there is an increased benefit from having a vaccine despite this very rare adverse effect. And this is informing member states, which in Europe are responsible for vaccination recommendation, to then define the vaccination strategy in the member state based on various factors like their infection rate, for example, which can alter the result, or the vaccinity as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Peter, what's your perspective on this benefit risk?
Yeah, I think actually Manuela actually described it pretty well, that the benefit risk here will depend on the rates of COVID-19. Where you have very high rates of COVID-19 throughout the population, then the benefit risk here the benefit far outweighs the risk. When you start to have very low rates of COVID-19, then this risk starts to become escalated, particularly in certain populations. And that's why some countries have decided that in, for instance, women under a certain age, for instance, age 39, they will not use these certain vaccines. And so it does depend a little bit. And I think there's no right answer here. It's an answer that's based on what the epidemiology is. Very high rates of COVID-19, and then you need to get the pandemic under control. Lower rates of COVID-19, then you're in a situation where, particularly if you have alternative vaccines to turn to, a certain population of people, particularly those most affected, which at least it seems to be the most affected population, are women ages 18 to about 39 or perhaps 49, depending on where how you do the data cuts. There, I think that's the population that might consider alternatives, and that's where some countries have made recommendations differently.
And so let me put you on the spot a bit here and ask you, what do you mean by low prevalence of COVID-19? So, because we seem to have a pretty high prevalence in most countries around the world.
Which is exactly why right now, yeah, Glenn, no one's gonna argue with you that right now probably the benefits here greatly outweigh the risks, and that's why when our advisory committee on immunization practices of the Centers for Disease Control in the United States looked at this, there was unambiguous that they said, look, keep vaccinating with this vaccine. But I think as we hopefully see cases in certain locations really start to drop, if you have a very modest amount of transmission going on, then perhaps you drop to a point where you can take, where other things factor in. But I'm not sure that we're going to get to that spot, at least in the United States, for at least several months to come. So for right now, I think the answer is, if you see a COVID-19 vaccine, it's not an unreasonable to take any one of them that's available.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to special populations. And within the hemophilia community, as I think we're all aware, we've had an epidemic of HIV, and we still have some individuals who 40 years later or so are still living with HIV in an immunocompromised state. We also have a small population of individuals who have had organ transplants and are severely immunocompromised. I want to ask Radek, who is an immunologist, for some of his thoughts on how we should be thinking about this in these immunocompromised populations and what we need to do to protect ourselves.
Thank you, Glenn. This is in fact one of the points we addressed in our latest publication highlighted by you and Cedric on Rationale and Modalities of Vaccination. Indeed, immunocompromised subgroups of people with bleeding disorders, such as people with HIV, or individuals who have undergone organ transplants and are on immunosuppression, may have reduced immune responses to vaccines. And so the effectiveness of vaccination in those individuals may be reduced. So it may be desirable to measure antibody titers in those individuals post-vaccination and potentially give them additional booster vaccine shots if they turn out to have low antibody titers. This is being discussed, and there is, as far as I know, there is no consensus guidance on this just yet, but be on the lookout for more information on this.
Okay, thank you. And Peter, I'm going to put you on the spot again here, and to Radek and myself, both of whom are immunologists by training, it seems like it's a pretty straightforward question to answer. What is your titer, and is that titer protective? And if not, get a boost. And yet we seem to be moving incredibly slowly at just acknowledging this obvious immunological fact, one that has been pioneered by hepatitis B vaccines. If you don't have a response, you take more of it. Why is it that we're not talking about this more and moving faster on this?
Yeah, I think some of this is maybe pandemic fatigue, because I agree with you that this is something I would be pretty interested in. I'm interested in it from the standpoint there are a lot of immunocompromised individuals, between leukemia patients, HIV patients, on who maybe even the least in some cases immunocompromised of compared to organ transplant recipients and those who've received recent chemotherapy. There are data starting to emerge in preprint form about using third doses of the mRNA vaccines and or sometimes cross-vaccinating. It will be nice to see people. I'm aware of people that are starting to get motivated to study third doses and study this rigorously, looking at titers. It's better late than never that they're getting going now, and that's probably the right thing to do, for people to look for studies where people are looking at giving that third dose. It does look encouraging that perhaps that third dose, just as you would expect, right, can sometimes get you there if you haven't responded sufficiently with the first two doses.
Okay, thank you. Claudia, I see you have put a link to a Washington Post article that came out a couple of days ago. And so we've got questions here about largely from individuals in lower income countries who are saying, what about us? And as I mentioned at the very beginning, the parallels on your map are identical to what we have with the availability of clotting factor concentrates around the world, completely dependent upon the classifications of these countries. And so we're accustomed to this. We don't have great solutions for this ourselves in our treatment community, but we have an urgency here that seems to not be recognized by the governments from the high-income countries, nor by the manufacturers. What more can we do?
Thanks, Glenn, and this was in reply to partial reply to what participants are posting in the chat. Indeed, it's not much. I mean, unfortunately, from the manufacturing perspective, there are limitations that manufacturing cycles, in terms of timing to get doses out, require. But as you said, governments have a commitment. I mean, a pandemic, either the virus is stopped everywhere, or it will continue to circulate and pose risk across the world, independently of income status. So the idea of sharing through donations what has been secured in this multi-billion doses contracts with manufacturer seems to be the fastest option that we have, while in parallel we try to increase manufacturing capacity. Right now, it's also an issue of capacity to manufacture enough vaccines. So it's not that we have them and we are not sending where everywhere is needed. It's a capacity limitation. So there are several tracks and several projects that are trying to expand through sharing of knowledge and IP rights knowledge, trying to expand manufacturing capacity, especially in developing countries, so that products are closer to those communities that seem to be left behind, and bring spillover effects to all the sectors in those communities. But it will require time. That's why the focus right now and the plea from all organizations trying to address this pandemic is to share what has been locked into contracts with manufacturers by governments, and see whether unlocking those doses that are not needed in these countries because they have enough to cover their populations and reach the herd immunity that will stop the virus from circulating and creating outbreaks, could be the solution and is the solution in the immediate.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot more work to do in that area. Some specific questions about vaccination. So, intramuscular vaccination in individuals with bleeding disorders is a risk. Cedric, can you give a brief comment on what we should be thinking about there with the IM injections?
Yes, it's a risk, but honestly, when I had the vaccine myself, I was really surprised by, it's a very, very small needle, very so small. So honestly, even if you have a severe bleeding disease, I don't think that this very small needle could cause major injury. But it's clear that if you have severe hemophilia, if you are on prophylaxis, it would ideally, if you could have your preventive injection of clotting factor, very close to the intramuscular injection, that would be ideal. But I'm even not sure this is compulsory. I even think that even in the absence of treatment, considering the needle, you won't get bleeding problems.
Okay. And we did write about that in our last Hemophilia journal article, the idea of keeping more pressure on it too, which
that's what you need to do,
which makes sense.
Sure.
There continues to be questions about these very rare risks and individuals with coagulation disorders. What I might say to that is that if there's a concern about thrombosis, it's not likely to affect individuals with coagulation disorders. Does anyone want to further comment on that? Yeah, Cedric.
Well, I agree. This risk of thrombosis is very, very small. Well, depending on the place where you live, but the last data that we have are really reassuring. But it's clear that, and that was discussed already. Depending on the severity of the pandemic and your age, you really need to balance the risk of thrombosis and the benefits of vaccination. That makes sense. If you are, let's say, 20 years of age, and you don't have any major risk factors for COVID, it's clear that I would avoid, the vaccines that have been associated with an increased risk of thrombosis, even if the thrombosis are exceptional. If you are, 60 years of age with obesity, hypertension, you should be vaccinated, and irrespectively of the kind of vaccine. But that should be openly discussed, and the patient need to understand this.
Well, and for our community who have clotting factor deficiencies, thrombosis, I think, perhaps is the least of our problems.
Yeah, and also people should not forget that when you develop COVID, the risk of thrombosis is major. So, and that risk is much higher than, the case of thrombosis that have been reported after vaccination. And, also getting COVID does expose you to the risk of developing, long COVID, and this is not good. And also the risk of, transmitting the disease to other persons. In my country, in Belgium, clearly patients who refused vaccination could be exposed, even to legal problems because they refuse vaccination and could transmit the disease to other people who could die because of it. So I think these are many, many reasons why people should do everything to be vaccinated if they have access to the vaccine.
Well, in one of the earlier articles that you and Radek and I had published on behalf of the Safety Committee really focused on what happens if an individual with a bleeding disorder gets COVID. And as you just pointed out, the management of an individual with a clotting factor deficiency who is then at risk for excess clotting because of COVID just becomes very, very complicated. And so better not to get it. I'm not sure if we can address this, but I wanted to ask our panelists about the Chinese and Russian vaccines. What should we be thinking about those? And the reason I'm asking is that because substantial proportions of our constituents have access only to those one or the other of those vaccines. I'm looking for volunteers here among our panelists.
What I can say is that both a Chinese vaccine from Sinovac and the Sputnik vaccine are under evaluation in the European Union. We have the so-called rolling review, which started the beginning of May for Sinovac and a little bit earlier for Sputnik. So the evaluation of the data is ongoing, and as soon as we reach a conclusion, this will be communicated. So it's two more tools which will add to the repertoire of vaccines that are available. So it's important that we look at everything that has sufficient proof of concept to go through the data, and this is what we are doing. And more information will be coming shortly.
And is there anywhere where our constituents can go to get any information that isn't necessarily part of the EMA, FDA on these vaccines? Because they're being made available now to people. Where can they get their questions answered? Any ideas?
And Glenn, if I can just jump in quickly, Sinovac has been listed for emergency use by WHO. So on WHO's website, there are all the data information needed. They may need some kind of translation from a very technical language to a more understandable one, but it's there. So the Chinese vaccine has gone through assessment from WHO. We have not received core data to be able to assess the Russian one. So far, but any vaccine, as you can see from presentation from Peter and Manuela, gone through a regulatory authority assessment, has then information available online. So for those, at least either from WHO or a stringent regulatory authority, you can get information.
Okay, thank you. Do we have?
And I will share on the chat the link.
Excellent, thank you. Any final comments in the last minute or two from any of our panelists?
This is Peter. I would simply just say that it's just there is currently probably the biggest thing that I can identify. The biggest problem we have with COVID-19 vaccines is hesitancy of people to take them. And I think the best solution for hesitancy is to just keep asking your questions till you feel comfortable that you've had them answered and that you get to a comfort level of being able to take one of these vaccines. Because what we've seen is the ravages of COVID are much worse than some of the perceived side effects of these vaccines. And unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-vaccination noise out there that makes it all the worse. So just get good information from trusted sources and get your questions answered.
All right, thank you. On behalf of all of the panelists, thank you all for attending. And our panelists, boy, thanks for just a terrific webinar, one of the best. So appreciate all of your efforts as well. With that, thank you all and have a good rest of the day.